Hi, my name is Hannah Schooldaughter, and I'm a student ambassador for the Conference on World Affairs. I'm also a student at CU Boulder studying mechanical engineering and political science. This month's CWA and law school event is entitled Back to the Future, Lessons for Our Emerging Challenges, from Science Fiction to History. And it should provide us with some insights on what we can expect in the next couple years. These past few months have been straight out of a science fiction movie. Most of us live our lives as one big Zoom meeting. We work, learn, and socialize through our screens and wear masks to protect our health. And us students, we have no idea what the future is going to look like when we prepare to graduate. There's uncertainty around every corner. Now we've elected a new president, but our country is split and we need to hold on to our common values. I really look forward to hearing what this panel has to say about our future. Thanks for tuning in. Enjoy.
Hello, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. And welcome to this evening's fifth annual John and Katherine Rosenbloom Endowed Lectureship Series. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize that the University of Colorado is located on land within the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho Peoples territories. I also acknowledge that 48 contemporary tribal nations are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. The University of Colorado Law School is honored to collaborate with the Conference on World Affairs, or CWA, on today's program featuring a panel of distinguished guests. The panel members will be introduced in a moment, but I want to give a special welcome to Congressman Joe Neguse. Thank you for joining us, Congressman. This is the fifth edition of the John and Katherine Rosenbloom Endowed Lectureship Series. This evening's program is entitled Back to the Future, Lessons for Our Emerging Challenges from Science Fiction and History. These are complex and highly challenging times on nearly every front. I anticipate that this evening's look into the future will provide us a welcome respite and with perhaps some optimistic glimpses. I want to thank both John and Kathy for their generous support of the law school and the CWA. So let's, however we can, recognize them for making this event possible. And I also want to thank all of the staff who helped put this event together. John Griffin, Katie Grady, and Erwin Rain from the CWA, and Yesenia Delgado and Georgette Vigil from the law school. We also owe a deep debt of gratitude to our terrific IT staff who are keeping the law school and our programming going during this time of virtual interaction. During the presentation, you're welcome to ask questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Questions will be monitored as they are submitted. You can vote on the questions that interest you most. The panel will respond to questions following the presentation. As a reminder, everyone is on mute. The moderator of this evening's discussion is Phil Weiser, the Attorney General of Colorado. Attorney General Weiser really needs no introduction, but let me highlight that before becoming the state's Attorney General, he was a member of the Colorado Law faculty and from 2011 to 2016 served as the Dean of the law school. His storied career also includes serving at the United States Department of Justice and on President Obama's transition team. And he clerked for United States Supreme Court Justices Byron White and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And we're very fortunate that Phil has continued to be an active member of the Colorado law community. I'm delighted to now turn the program over to our moderator, Attorney General Phil Weiser.
Thank you, Jim. Really appreciate your leadership. We are living in a challenging time, and you and Colorado law and the whole Colorado family have really been a source of strength for so many. The Colorado law community also celebrates Joe Neguse, one of our own, who I had the pleasure of knowing when he was a student. He was a star then, he's a star now. It's great to have you here with us, Congressman. Patty Limerick is a member of the History Faculty, a MacArthur Genius Award winner, and she truly, truly is an inspiration, written many storied books, and is always a great panel participant, founder and director of Center for American West. Brad Feld is an incredible friend of CU, has supported CU through so many different ways, shapes, and forms. He and I have collaborated on many efforts together, including co-chairing the Innovation Council for Governor Bill Ritter. He is a renowned venture capitalist who's helped found, support many very successful, impactful companies. And finally, Blake Crouch is Colorado's own science fiction author. For those unfamiliar with Blake's work, you're missing out. I would strongly encourage you. You might start with a book called Recursion, which was a recent book he wrote that brilliantly picks up on themes around time travel. Another one, Dark Matter, is also celebrated his prior book. He is truly a great science fiction author, and we're so fortunate to have him. So we've got a talented group, and we had a fabulous introduction, which I really appreciated, from a student noting the nature of the moment we're now in. And I just want to thank John Griffin for embracing this program as part of CWA, and mostly John and Kathy Rosenbloom for being really, really committed to this sort of dialogue. And I am grateful for their support. Let me just start with a very high level question, give everyone a chance to jump in on it, which is, as we try to make sense of what is, and I love the student introduction, this is an historically challenging time during this pandemic, during a surreal post-election period. As we try to make sense of this, either through the lens of science fiction or history, what tools, what advantages can we glean to each get a grip on where where we're going, and how we think about it? So Patty, I'm going to start with you. Obviously, the historical lens is the one you bring to bear, and there's been a lot of discussion about how do we compare this moment to other historical moments, and what do we learn from it? What is your take on that?
I'm sorry, I thought that the host was going to. Okay, got it. Alrighty, just as well, because I wasn't saying anything worth hearing at that moment. So I think that this is an unparalleled moment in many, many dimensions. I'm going to have to say the usual thing we say: 1850s, very rough period, start of the Civil War, very hard. No social media, no nuclear weapons in the picture. I mean, it's just, it seems like there's so many variables. I won't go through listing them, but it's very hard to say, oh, well, this has been there, done that. I can tell you that we'll get through this. And usually it takes 2.5 months after. No, can't do that. But I think there's so many opportunities to say that humans demonstrate extraordinary qualities of resilience and innovation and creativity. And there is nothing that says that a fatalistic, gloomy prediction is more realistic or more likely to come true than a cheerful one. So the edge of the moment, this happens to be true what happened to dead people in history too. They were alive, and they stood at the edge of a moment, and they could not see past that moment. So we have that in common with all of our predecessors on the planet. So on this one, I think it's extremely important to avoid the fatalism thing and to say, the future could go in many different directions, and there is nothing that says that the gloomy prediction is the most convincing one. I do think the great neglect, and this is something that people do remark about Abraham Lincoln and these terrible times of the 1850s and early 1860s, he had a sense of humor. He had a capacity to just step away or go a little higher, and that humor is an incredibly underutilized feature of our world today. And I know it can seem like it's too serious to go there to do humor, but that's passing up redemption, if you ask me. If we think, oh, it's too serious to try humor, that is something that never occurred to Abraham Lincoln as a way to conduct himself.
We'll talk more about political discourse. Lincoln's use of humor was legendary. A famous line was, when accused of having duplicity in his positions, he said, "What, you're calling me two-faced? If I had two faces, why would I wear this one?" Making fun of his own appearance.
That's my case.
Brad, you've often said that we need to read more and think more about science fiction. So Patty is not giving us quite as much of an historical perspective on this. We've had a lot of references to some dark science fiction to understand today's moment and where we are in a society. How do you come to terms with what are the key forces that are driving where we are, and what do you learn from science fiction or history when you think about them?
A word I would toss out for people to consider about the moment we're in is the word liminal, and the idea of a liminal space. And it's very common that you see in any sort of dynamics where there's tension, where there's always this period of uncertainty and discomfort and just lack of clarity of what's going to happen next before then the next thing happens. And we're in that period. And I think we're in that period not just because of the COVID crisis, not just because of the political dynamics. I think we're in that period because we just are in the midst of what was in the last 9 months, I would suggest that we've had 5 years of acceleration of both good and bad in our society. So, humans are not that used to discontinuity. We're not that used to phase shift or phase transformations when things looked a certain way and then something happened and then suddenly they were different. We really want things to progress linearly, good or bad. And we really want to control things from the top down. And frankly, none of those things actually ever really happen, but we create these stories all the time so that we feel like that kind of thing is what's going on. The COVID crisis just dramatically accelerated many of these things that were progressing. And again, good ones and bad ones. And some of them are things that are not new, right? Racial equity is a crisis that this country's been struggling with since inception. And the COVID crisis, and I've described it as health crisis that generated an economic crisis, which is generating a mental health crisis, which has amplified a racial equity crisis. These are all complex systems. They don't have a deterministic outcome. And when you move forward in 9 months by 5 years, it's extraordinarily disorienting. We're in that moment. And for me personally, what I've done is I've just assumed that I'm in 2025 going to 2026. In January of 2020, if we had told everyone that anybody who's an office worker is going to be interacting with each other from their living room or from their house via Zoom around the world, and our economy would be whatever it is, like there's big negatives in our economy, but there are plenty of companies that are doing quite well against the backdrop of what is now extraordinary inequity because of the acceleration of time, right? The inequity is not new, but compress 5 years of it into 9 months and you get crazy amplification effects. All of that stuff, like as we cycle back, if you think that we're in 2025, it's actually kind of interesting to say, well, what would I want 2026 to have in it? What incumbent dynamics would I want to have collapse? What things that don't work would I want to change? And what things that I treasure do I want to make sure that I'm doing? And I'll sort of end this rant with the idea that there's a phrase that's emerged in the last couple of months that I think should be banished. And that phrase is the new normal. And it's just another attempt of humans as a species to define what normal is and kind of to link us back to January 2020 and say, yeah, there's some things that are different, but we're going to go back to normal. Versus sort of embrace the idea that, it's a continually different thing. And we've just had this dramatic effect that we're still in the middle of, hence the liminal state. But that on the other side of it could be very different. Doesn't have to be dystopic, doesn't have to be utopic. It'll be different.
Blake, your works, I mentioned time travel, another concept that's very important in science fiction that you've also executed very well, the multiverse, which is they're different universes side by side. We're in all of them. We're making different decisions in each of them. Different things happen. For those who've ever watched the TV series The Flash, you get a sense of what we're talking about here. The point Brad makes is a little relevant here, which is we can imagine different presents, different futures. And what's been dizzying about this moment is how we've, whatever word you want to use, acceleration or disruptive change, that's hard on people. And part of what we're grappling with is coming to grips with major changes quickly. As you think about this moment, and you, again, have the benefit of having thought deeply about some science fiction concepts, what are some of your thoughts?
I keep coming back to the concept of a consensus reality, which is something that sort of guided us until this moment. The idea that we all can kind of agree what the color green is. We all can agree what the color red is. But if you really think about it and you kind of dig deep into the science and some of the studies, you start to wonder, I mean, when I say the color green and I think of it, are you thinking of the exact same thing? And the can of worms this opens up is, and I can't help but be terrified by it every day when I go down the rabbit hole of Twitter or Facebook or all these spurious platforms, is we can't agree on what's real and what truth is. And I write a lot in my books about reality. I mean, I would say that's probably the overarching theme I'm chasing, is what is reality? Reality is not the same to any of us. We all have our frames of reference. And it's really interesting when Patty was talking about the Civil War and kind of comparing that to this time, and in terms of a moment of explosive change and this acceleration of, I remember when I was in 1986, the Challenger blew up, and it feels like now the Challenger blows up like 4 times a day. And when we try to grapple with that, and we grapple with that not only in the news, but in a constant feed of what millions and millions of our fellow citizens are putting out there. And it's like we're having this mind share with everyone. And the dissonance between what I think and what you think and what 100 million other people think, it makes me wonder, how do we ever get on the same page about something like COVID, which should be the pretty clear, stark example of a threat. And we're sitting around arguing about whether it's real, whether nurses are paid actors. I saw a tragic and amazing video report in the Denver Post, followed a nurse walking out of a hospital as she was screamed at. People think this is an actor when there are people dying inside. And I just think about how reality has never been presented in such a way as my reality, your reality, everyone else's reality. And it's so different. And and if we can't agree on sort of the pillars of this moment, how do we move forward from it? So I come back to this just idea of a consensus reality. And I think a lot about, well, what are the big scientific breakthroughs that we need in this moment? Of course, the vaccine, we need that vaccine to come through. We need to figure out how to talk to each other. But I would like to write the science fiction book where we all figure out how to evaluate this moment and pull out what's real and pull out what isn't. I think we're having a break from what is real, and that is the heart of what is sort of dividing us in this moment. And it's not just dividing; it's threatening to really rip out the ground underneath us.
Joe, let me take this really thoughtful point by Blake and frame it for you a little bit as follows. And this was a tweet of mine on this, there was a court case recently involving a claim of a voter fraud. And the judge said to the lawyer, do you have any actual evidence that voter fraud's happening? And the lawyer said, no, I don't. And my tweet was, in a court of law, we operate in the world of facts and law. But in the world of politics, to Blake's point, people can make all sorts of claims. And then the question becomes, what do people vote for, whether in a legislature or the public? And I think the challenge to law, politics, and governance in this moment is framed up really well by Blake. As you are there in Washington, working on addressing COVID in this environment, how do you see it, and how do you find your inspiration to work towards a consensus reality when that's not something we can take for granted?
Well, it's a great question, and it's an honor to join this distinguished panel. I must say, I could listen to Blake and Brad and Professor Limerick all evening. I would say this. There's actually a very interesting interview just earlier today with the lieutenant governor of Pennsylvania, who was asked about the voter fraud allegations. And he made a very similar point to the one that you just made, Attorney General Weiser, which was, the math doesn't care about anyone's feelings, the president's feelings or anyone else's for that matter. The math is the math, right? It's a fundamental rule, and the math dictates that a certain electoral outcome in that instance. But as you said, for whatever reason, the rules of gravity, the rules of math don't necessarily apply in the world of politics. And I guess what I would say, I think that Blake summarized one of the most consequential challenges that we face as a society, and certainly that our political leaders face, which is, I agree, the consensus reality that I suppose we all had gotten fairly acclimated to, and there's sort of a general sense that that we could all come to terms with, is dissipating very quickly. And ironically enough, technology, which is arguably the greatest catalyst for advancement of human civilization in the history of the world, also happens to be in my view, one of the leading reasons why that consensus reality is evaporating before our eyes. And we could spend the entire evening talking about the echo chambers that are Twitter and Facebook and the other social media engines, and the antitrust implications, which is of course an entirely separate conversation. So it is a tough question. I'm not sure that I necessarily have an answer. I think that when I think about this conversation and sort of the role of history and how it dictates policy outcomes, or how I evaluate the actions that we take on Capitol Hill, I look at it from a far more utilitarian framework, I guess, which is, I'm a lawyer, not a scientist. And so although Interstellar is my favorite movie, I'm not nearly as imaginative as Blake and Brad and others on this panel. But I guess I think of sort of two bookend quotes. One is, of course, the perhaps cliched, but one that we all are familiar with, which is, those who don't remember the past are, condemned to repeat it. And so obviously we can go back in time with respect to American history, some of the challenges we're experiencing right now at the federal level. And you could find corollaries in the 1850s, as was mentioned, and during the presidencies of Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan, post-compromise of 1850, leading up to the Civil War. There are other parallels that one could draw from the Reconstruction period, reading a great biography on Grant, and a number of different very, I think, interesting corollaries that you could draw. And yet, the other bookend, because while all of that is informative and it certainly helps us in Washington, I think, have greater context about the decisions that we're making, it's also important to approach this with a sense of humility. And there's a quote from Napoleon, which is that history is the version of past events that people have decided to agree upon, right? It's tough for us 150 some odd years later to really get a great sense of clarity as to precisely how those events unfolded and how they were received and experienced at that moment in time, as those individuals, as Professor Limerick said, were looking over the cliff. So I suppose I'm more confused than I was when I started. You answered your question, Phil, but
no, Joe, it's great. I want to let Patty get to the history quote you did in consensus reality. But before that, Joe, I got to follow up with another point from you, because you teed it up nicely with social media and different people living in different information realities. We are also getting more political polarization and demonization than ever before. You have made it such a point of your service to lead with empathy and building relationships in a way that you are doing your part not to drive those dynamics. Could you say a word about your efforts to do that and what you're up against?
Sure, and I'd be very interested to hear Brad's take on this as well, in terms of the profit motive, obviously, of some of these companies, because obviously from their perspective, the incentive structure is such that it's in their interest to have us on a constant feedback loop, right? And generally speaking, you could go days, weeks, months, years in the current environment without talking to anybody who has a different worldview than your own. You watch a cable news television show that tells you exactly what you'd like to hear. You follow individuals on Facebook or Twitter or the other social media engines or platforms that concur with your assessment of the world's events. You have networks that are human networks, right, in terms of society, they're becoming more and more segregated. And I don't mean that in the racial sense, although that certainly is part of that, but I mean on an ideological basis, on religious basis, right? And for me, I've always learned the most by talking to people who see the world fundamentally different in a different way than I do. I tend to learn the most from those conversations. I find those interactions to be some of the richest interactions that I can have. And it certainly makes me a much better public servant. And so I've worked very hard in Congress and, try to encourage others to do the same, to try to expand their own worldviews and engaging with people who perhaps see the world a little differently. But look, the only way you can really do that in good faith is to start from a premise of not impugning or questioning others' motives. And unfortunately, that is something that has become all too common, and again is reinforced by the constant feedback loops of these echo chambers. It's a tough challenge, a puzzle that we're going to have to figure out a way out of.
Joe, I so appreciate you doing that. Let me add a point to your commitment to empathy and not calling other people's good faith into question. I gave a talk at Fort Collins. Someone came up to me afterwards and said, it was at CSU, why are you for this red flag law and against the Second Amendment? I'm really bothered by that. And one thing I've learned to this point, I'm with you, Joe, in trying to overcome polarization and demonization, never convince someone or try to convince someone that they're wrong. Instead, ask questions to understand what leads them to think the way they do. So I say to the person, well, this red flag law allows you to take a firearm away from someone who's a significant risk to themselves or others. Why are you more worried about us taking a firearm away from someone who is a responsible gun owner, as opposed to not taking one away from someone who with that firearm will kill herself? And the person said to me, that's a good question. I've got to think about it.
Wow.
And then is engaged with their advisor. So there's something to your approach. I'm trying to practice it too. All right, we got two questions now, one for Patty, one for Brad. Brad's question is about algorithms. I'll get to that in a minute. Patty, your question is, Joe says this history is what people have agreed to all believe. What do you make of the idea of a consensus reality and shared history, given your really incredible thoughtfulness on this very point? How do you explain this?
I think I am just going to bring, it will seem like I'm making a very significant downer of a remark, and it will just cheer you up tremendously when I take it just a little bit further. So good news, ladies and gentlemen, in the American West over the last 250, 300 years, there has been no consensus reality. Yay, welcome. No need to worry about that, because all of the different Indian people in this region, all of the different colonists, the French colonists, the Spanish colonists, the Russians for that matter, I mean, everybody coming in, bumping into each other and thinking, who in heaven's name is that? And what on earth are they thinking? So I am proud to say that my area of study is so much a place of chaos, and it's such a mess for 300 years or so. So I just can't think, I mean, I don't want to take up time with just saying these wonderful moments, and there are billions of them, of people of different tribes meeting other tribes and just saying, you think that, do you? Now, the problem is they couldn't say, you think that, do you? Probably Indian people were ahead of that in intertribal context, but mostly people were speaking different languages. So before they could get around to finding how differently they saw the world, they had to have the coolest people on the planet, really. Some of them are terrible people, but they are cool, translators and interpreters. So that's what I'm thinking is really what's the missing topic in our whole agenda as a society. I am sad to tell you that my people have screwed up, and Western American historians have written almost nothing about translators and interpreters. But every time Indian and white people met in a consequential discussion, the interpreter, the translator, was the key figure there in many, many measures. So that I am proud to say that my young colleague, who is much smarter and much livelier than I, Alice Baumgartner, recent PhD, she and I are working on a project on interpreters, and she's doing most of the work. So she's working on the project and I'm cheering on the sideline, because that's the missing story, is who gets to be in the middle of these conversations where, again, I cannot say many places. I would have a little trouble saying, well, here's where two groups of people from two different backgrounds met and just understood each other and thought, do you think that? That's what we think too. really hard for me to come up with many of those from the 18th century or the 19th century, or for that matter, the 20th century. So I am happy to tell you that we're a mess now, and that's not news. We've been a mess in different ways, these conflicting stories and conflicting points of view. And I'm hoping that we can have a framework where the historical study of how people misunderstood each other, got their wires crossed, just didn't see reality in the same way, how those encounters in the past have shaped us. Then I do want to say that whatever people are thinking, they have bodies and they have physical experiences and they have a life that is material. And that is not, there's a certain point where if water is not in the picture for you, it doesn't matter what your point of view is, what your feelings about water are. If you are dehydrated and you're getting to a dangerous level of that, it doesn't matter what your ethnicity is, what your point of view, your identity. So I think there's something about the material reality of human beings. And I know this is seeming to make no sense because that dreadful virus is a material reality thing. And we have gone to town and conjuring up with interpretations from it isn't happening to it is a plot from another nation sent at us. I mean, all kinds of things have been put into that. But at some point, there's the fact that people live, eat, reproduce, want the offspring to survive. There's something that I actually do think could pass for common ground, even if there's many different interpretations put on that material reality. I rest my case, Your Honor. So there we go.
Thank you, Patty. Brad, two questions, one from Joe, one from a member of the audience here.
Before we do the questions, Phil, can I build on what Patty just said?
Go take Patty's thing first. Yep.
Yeah, and I'll touch back on some of the things that have been said over the last 10 minutes. I want to start with the idea of consensus reality, and I want to just sort of contrast it to one of my favorite ever news headlines, which is from The Onion. And if you don't read The Onion, I will tell you it is the source of truth for the universe, delivered with much sarcasm. And it's a headline that says, Ben Bernanke says, this is in the global financial crisis in 2010 or 2009, says, Ben Bernanke says money is a consensual hallucination versus a consensus reality. He didn't say versus a consensus reality, but I want to put those two in contrast. And I want to really underscore what Patty said is I don't actually think that in our history, we have been operating from a perspective of consensus reality. One of my favorite books of last year is a book called Fantasyland, How America Went Haywire, a 500-year history. It's a big book. It's 500 pages. And it's basically 500 pages that describe the endless, complete delusions and illusions that exist throughout different parts of American society through the creation of our country, and the endless polarization of perspectives. And there was, at one point, about halfway through the book, the author makes the comment like, you think that, religion is a global thing. We have created more crazy religions in the United States from the beginning than any other place on planet Earth. So sort of this notion that somehow we're in a different kind of structural mindset, I disagree with. The thing I strongly, and I think, Patty, you said that, the thing I strongly agree with is that technology has accelerated the communication of it and has been an incredibly powerful force of bad. And I want to link to that, which is that any new tool can be good or bad. I'm going to give you a hammer as an example. When somebody created the hammer is very useful. You can hammer in nails, and you can also smash someone's head open with it. So you have the same tool, a hammer, that can be very good or very bad. We are in this construct in 2020 where we have such an interdependency with these technologies, and we can call them out specifically in different ways if we want, that fundamentally are human manipulation machines. And part of the way they manipulate us, and Blake said it very well, is you go down the rabbit hole of Twitter or Facebook. And even if you go searching for people that have a different frame of reference than you, you're then immediately in that rabbit hole. And so you get this reinforcement of crazy rather than the experience of learning, facts, et cetera. And it's not just technology on the internet, it's media, go down the list, right? So we're stuck in that zone, and I'll sort of end this rant with something that I think is super important. And I think, Joe, I think you said this. If there was anything that would have catalyzed the United States of America to act like the United States of America to deal with something, it should have been a 120 nanometer virus that is now wreaking havoc on not just the economy, but all aspects of our society, our health, our loved ones, et cetera. And roughly 50% of the country doesn't think it's a real thing. What happens when the aliens show up? I mean, that's the book I want to read from Blake. I mean, the aliens are going to show up. Like, when they show up, what happens then? And if you just want an example, again, of how flawed our response as human beings will be, I give you a movie from a couple of years ago called The Arrival. And if you watch The Arrival, you watch sort of in 2 hours just this spectacular example of how unable we are when faced with an external, exogenous, unexpected phenomena. It doesn't have a happy ending, right? It's not dystopic, but we just can't get coordinated because there's such different frames of reference. And then there isn't that unifying force. So I think we're sort of stuck in that. And technology is making it worse, not better, against the backdrop of slogans like, put a dent in the universe and do no evil and things like that, or whatever. But technology is also an incredibly powerful positive tool. What do you do with that? Like, I don't have a declarative answer, but like that's the problem space we're operating in, while things are accelerating at a pace that none of us can process.
Blake, let me take that question for Brad, give it to you. Oh, sorry.
Go to somebody else now.
That's okay. No, because I think you got a different question, Blake, because Brad teed it up. During this moment where it is so destabilizing, does this make it easier for you to think about science fiction, or does it make it harder?
Oh, wow. I mean, it makes it more distracting. It makes it feel more like not science fiction. Like, I don't think science fiction is an appropriate modifier anymore. It's just fiction now, or nonfiction. I think the future's here. And I was shaking my head when Brad was like, when the aliens show up. I mean, you can do near light speed interstellar travel. I don't know if you're going to come to our hot garbage planet at the moment. It makes me like the book I'm writing right now. I was working on it through the summer, and I'd gotten so a book for me is about 100,000 words, and I got to the 70,000 word point, and I was like, this is not relevant enough. And the landscape of what we were all experiencing was changing so dramatically. I was like, I just need to set this aside, because what I actually need to be writing about is this this dissonance we're all feeling. And so I went down that road, and it was absolutely the right choice. And it unfortunately pushed out my publication of my next book, but no one's paying attention to anything but our current crisis right now. Anyway, I don't know. I look to, I think fiction is, I think it's more important now than ever. I think it's a really fascinating mirror for our times. It's also an escape. And that's what I've been head down and trying to focus on. And it's allowed me to sort of just go down the hole of why are we in this place? Why have we walked on the moon and sequenced our own DNA? And built a telescope that can look billions and billions of years into the past, and we still don't agree that a virus that is obviously deadly is killing us. Why are we in this place? That's what fascinates me now, and that's what's driving me now. And I think I'll just share a little of kind of what I'm coming around to, is I think that as we, as a species, began 200,000 years ago, we were like the idea of myth, the idea of, we didn't have science, we didn't have math, and there was but we had awareness. We had the awareness of pain, we had the awareness of uncertainty, and if it didn't rain, our crops didn't grow, and we died. And we are aware of the idea of death and not what comes after, and our brains can't really process the idea of unbeing. And so, of course, we developed this beautiful thing called myth, which is the belief in fantasy, the unknown, overlaying story and overlaying truth where none exists. And so we have, and that stuff gets encoded into our genes, into our genetic hardwiring. But at the same time, we have all this whole slate of Aristotle, Archimedes, Ptolemy, all these amazing thinkers who, at the same time, we have this path of myth, we have this also path of truth and math and scientific method, and these kept going and going and going. And we have, while we have this exploding intelligence, we still also have this hardwiring deep in our genetic code that wants to believe in myth. And by the way, I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. It's clearly been a great thing for our species. It's been the thing that organized our species and gave us civilizations while we're kind of ruling the planet. So I don't know, I look at us as a species right now, and I see us having two things. We have this incredible capability to get ourselves out of this problem, but we also have, right now it feels like an Achilles heel, we have this genetic hardwiring also holding us back, because we want to believe in the big existential blanket that comforts us and makes us feel better about uncertainty, and things that we don't have answers to.
Joe, I know you may not be able to stay with us the whole time. We got a question from Fred Gluck that is right up your alley. Given the level of disinformation, misinformation, lies, and the dominance of algorithms driving people's attention to them, is there a role for legislation and or regulation that would do something about this?
I think the answer is yes. I mean, certainly in my view, I think there's a role to play. I must confess, I'm still very much stuck on the very compelling philosophical case I think that Brad makes about consensus reality and whether or not we in fact have a consensus reality or ever have had one. And of course, it's undergirded by the historical case that Professor Limerick makes, and I think he gets into a broader thought, for me anyways, about whether or not, to the extent one can argue that we had a consensus reality, perhaps one can't make that argument or it may not be an intellectually honest argument, but nonetheless, you take it at face value that perhaps technology helped create that consensus reality, and as I said before, is now very quickly assisting in the collapse of whatever consensus reality we've had. So anyway, I'm going to spend a lot of time tonight thinking about that question that Brad has posed. But apropos of the question that was posed in terms of the disinformation and the misinformation, if we can see that there is a consensus reality and that these social media engines are in effect harming our ability to come to terms with it because of the feedback loop that so many, Brad and others have talked about. Yes, I think the answer is yes. I think that there's a role for Congress to play. There's a role for our federal regulators at the FTC to play. There's a role for our very effective attorneys general to play. And of course, we're lucky to have an attorney general in Phil Weiser, who's been one of the leaders in that regard. And he can talk about some of the work that his office is doing or has done already. Yes, I think there is a role. It's a nuanced conversation, because obviously we want to also ensure that the ecosystem remains as robust as it can be to create the kind of innovation that, as Brad said, has created tools that have assisted human civilization in ways that are hard for us to even describe, right? If you think about medical advancements, for example. And yet, it's very clear that what is happening on these social media platforms is very destructive and corrosive to our democracy and to the way in which we as citizens and fundamentally as a species interact with each other. So yes, there's a role, but it's an open question about what that what that role will be in the coming years.
I want to jump to Patty with a question that came from Leslie Eaton. The Spanish flu was the last time, 1918-ish, that we had a pandemic. Did we see the dynamics that Blake described where people were denying reality back then? How was that era similar or different to this one, Patty? And you're on mute right now.
I beg your pardon. Just trying not to get into technology in a way that will take me down a rabbit hole. And if I keep the mute thing on, apparently I can stay on that. Sorry, I just was careless there. I think Leslie has raised a question that we've gone on and on and on for the last 8 months about this 1918 thing and what is similar and what is different and so on. And I cannot think of a thing I've heard a historian say or an encounter. I think of the writer Wallace Stegner, who was totally shaped by being a child at the time of the 1918. People think, why was he so gloomy? Well, 8 years old in his schoolhouse, sick with his family in there and the neighbors and so on. Anyway, we have talked a lot about the psychological impacts of 1918 flu, but I can't think of a moment when somebody has said, well, of course, then there were all these people who just refused to say this was happening. In some communities, the scale was so intense that it would have been, maybe that's the measure that we have public health systems that they did not have that in some ways conceal what they all saw. So the terrible story of the nurse being accused of being an actress. Well, the dying and the misery and the inability to breathe, that's in the hospital room where people don't go and can't see it. I think the visibility of Wallace Stegner was in his schoolhouse as a sick kid. There was no hiding from that. So I'm just trying to think of how, I think what has changed this are 7,000 factors. One of them is that the hyper visibility, our neighbors are sick, our neighbor has died. That was so, you couldn't avert your eyes from that. You could quarrel over some of the proper responses to that, how you should conduct yourself. But I think she said a wonderful point there that it really, and kind of reinforcing my idea that somehow our material reality as human beings, if we can see that, if that is not concealed from us, that might be the thing that gets us out of this chase of whose facts are whose facts. I do want to say I have had this, I think I've had a vision that could save humanity. So I think I better share that. Well, I have the moment here, which is if we create what Blake said about myth, I thought, well, no, that's getting a little sensitive here because I can debunk the idea that there was ever a consensus reality in the American West. I could do that. I don't see why we couldn't, I'd shut up really. If people wanted to create a myth that we had a consensus reality and a powerful, moving, electrifying, engaging, persuasive, recruiting myth that we had that. And now we have taken that away from ourselves. So Blake, if this is not getting too weird here, I am saying, instead of saying, oh, there's myth and then there's reality, I'm saying maybe we collaborate on a myth that there was a time when humanity was not so disordered in so many different ways of viewing reality. And I take Brad's point about the technology having so accelerated what was there among human beings and taking it to a whole new level. Well, I don't see why we couldn't have a compelling workshop, just this team, we can stay on for a while after this and do a workshop on how to create a compelling myth that human beings are capable of consensus reality and they once had it in spades. And they once pulled together and helped each other out and did not spend enormous amounts of, I mean, I don't care if it's true or not. Oh, it's terrible. I'm going to lose my degree. Yale is coming after me right now to take my degree away from my saying this, but I wouldn't, if that myth got traction, if Congressman by that myth, you needn't worry about me coming in with the debunking machine. That's going to be disabled.
Well, Patty, let me defend that with a Yale law professor. Robert covers his name. He's teaching his class the famous Brandeis decision about the First Amendment, case called Whitney versus California. And Brandeis says, our founders weren't afraid of clashing battles of ideas and celebrating the First Amendment. And someone in the class says to Professor Robert Cover, isn't that overly romantic? Because these same founders enacted a law called the Alien and Sedition Acts that criminalized political speech. And he said, of course it was romantic. That was the point, which is we should elevate the myth of a robust First Amendment because we think it's a good thing,
right?
Even if we have to overlook some counterfactual challenges.
Right. And I will say we will have nothing left in ideals if we have to discredit every ideal because the people who held it did not live up to it.
Well, there's a great now case because Lin-Manuel Miranda, great myth making, Alexander Hamilton really gets how wrong slavery was. Contemporary historians now saying it looks like Hamilton might have purchased slaves.
Yeah.
Right. So I got a question for Brad because Michelle poses it, and I think it's something we haven't focused on, but it's really painfully relevant, which is part of what's happening in this moment, Brad, the acceleration is a rural-urban divide. And you and I have talked about this a lot. Obviously, people in rural areas are living in a different reality in many ways that is a threat to our republic and shared commitment. How do you think about this divide and how we address it?
I think it's in some ways, I've evolved to a place where I think it's more complicated than just a rural-urban divide. There's a great simulation map of the voting, red-blue voting activity by, not by county, but by population center in the US. And the map starts with, a typical US map, with red and blue by county. So you see sort of all these red clusters and then little blue clusters in the cities and blue on the coast. But then it actually shows it by where people physically are. And what you get is an enormous amount of white space. And the reason you get an enormous amount of white space is that people don't live in concentrated ways in these rural communities. And, if you sort of watch the voting thing in the, the states that especially some of the ones that flipped from Trump early lead to then Biden winning by a lot because of the voting dynamics, you can kind of easily attribute some of that motion again to voting in person versus mail-in voting. But it doesn't really give voice to the dynamics. And I'm going to use Colorado as an example. I know Colorado best. It's hard for me to use Wyoming as an example or Ohio as an example here because I just don't know them as well. I grew up in Texas. I could use Texas as an example, but as a Coloradan, Texas bores me now. I spend most of my time in two places, Boulder and Aspen. I actually live more now in Aspen than I do in Boulder. Aspen is a city. It's a city with 5,000 people. In the context of urban-rural divide, it's viewed as part of rural Colorado. If you visit Aspen, or if you're somebody who flies to Aspen on your private plane, or you're one of the 1 million people a year that come to Aspen for the Aspen Ideas Festival or skiing or something like that, you're not really experiencing rural Colorado. However, if you live in Basalt, which is 10 miles away, or you live in Carbondale, which is 30 miles away, you're really living in rural Colorado. So you have these very interesting dynamics around movement of people in and out of places. And in Colorado, what is so powerful is that that's actually a positive attribute of our state. And it's a way to knit together some of these geographic differences. It's actually also a very huge disadvantage of our state in managing COVID, because a big part of our challenge in managing COVID is the movement of people in and out of Colorado. In addition, I have my wife's family is in Hotchkiss, which is very much rural Colorado. When I used to go there, I don't do Christmas anymore, but when I used to go there for Christmas, I think I was the only Jewish person, in 30 or 40 square miles, maybe 100 square miles, whatever, bigger than that. I wasn't quite an alien in some ways, but like the dimension of the humanness of the people was not one where like, oh, we're rural Colorado and you're urban Colorado, therefore you're bad and we're good or we're different. Just humans, they're just Coloradans, and they have different points of view and different things that matter and come from different places. But there is this communication, there is this conversation that at the meta level, when we abstract it to the urban-rural divide in the US, I think loses a lot of that nuance. And I think it's been hyper-politicized. My parents live in Dallas, Texas. They have a place, 100 acres in Bells, Texas, which is very much rural Texas. And I see even just through that lens, the hyper-politicization of I'm a city person versus I'm not a city person. And yet when you sit down and have dinner or talk to people or spend time with them or talk about what their hopes and goals and aspirations for their kids are, for what they're not that far apart. And so that fabric, I think we're messing up very, very badly through the division of it. The inverse of it, and I'll just end with this because I could talk about this for a long time, but I think is so very, very difficult, is we're now in a mode, at least in the US, where the tribe you belong to, sorry to use the word tribe in the context of that, I sort of recognize that that's probably not the right word to use, the club, the identity you have on whatever the dimension is. And it doesn't have to be, as Joe said earlier, like it's not necessarily racial, it doesn't have to be gender, it doesn't have to be religion, it doesn't have to be, who you voted for. One of the things that's fascinating is that we're so tied now as humans to those identities. And that's part of what I think we're letting the machines use to manipulate us. And people who are very good at wanting to manipulate us have become experts at using the machines to manipulate us. And Phil and I talk about this, this sort of dynamic around human beings responding to what they're being programmed to respond to, rather than stepping back and thinking about what they actually care about and sort of avoiding it. We're fighting now against people who are spending enormous amounts of money to get us to have a point of view and really to respond to the fundamental thing that most human beings respond to, which is fear, right? And the cliche in most business decisions and most human decisions, in business, you respond to one of two things, fear or greed. If you own investments, and you think about whether you buy or sell things, fear or greed comes up over and over again. All of a sudden, that the manipulation machines are so focused on fear, and that amplifies the polarization. There's a moment, I'm not going to get the moment right, Blake, you might remember, in Recursion. And it's about 2/3 of the way through the book. I don't want to do spoilers. The book's, both books that Phil mentioned, Dark Matter and Recursion, are spectacular books. And they challenge very different things. It's this very interesting moment where about 2/3 of the way through the book, I all of a sudden started to get really fearful because of something that was happening when there was a reveal around one of the protagonists. And I was fearful of where the book was going to go because I really wanted it to go somewhere else. It actually went, where I wanted it to go. That tension, I remember it because I was thinking about it for this call, that tension was so powerful. We are being hit with that hundreds of times a day. And, the 4 times a day that we're having the Challenger blow up. I remember when the Challenger blew up, I was at my grandparents' house in Florida. Like, anybody sort of on this call probably remembers that moment, like the generation that's older than me remembers the JFK moment. Hundreds of times a day that's happening whenever you look at Facebook, whenever you look at Twitter, whenever you look at Google News, whenever you turn on CNN, whenever you turn on Fox News. And if you just want to see how much it's happening, spend an hour, 10 minutes at a time, watch CNN for 10 minutes, watch Fox News for 10 minutes, CNN for 10 minutes, Fox News for 10 minutes, CNN for 10 minutes, Fox News for 10 minutes. At the end of the hour, you'll say, yep, doesn't matter what I think, we're all getting manipulated here in meaningful ways through fear.
So I've got a follow-up question for Joe and then one for Blake. Joe, the one from you, it comes from Elise, and it follows what Brad's saying, which is, I love Congressman Negus's comment about learning from those we don't agree with. That's the way I live my life and try to practice daily. I would love to hear from Joe how he's working to make this change in our society, which is already so polarized. So Joe, this fear that's being pushed, driving polarization and demonization on both your personal level you talked about, but on a broader level, how do we turn this around?
It's a great question. And I might suggest, although I don't know that it will be an experience that you would necessarily enjoy, but I would take the advice or the admonition that Brad offered, and I would encourage every person who's watching tonight to do what Brad just described. And here's what I mean, right? I mean, of course, it's much easier to do in our personal lives than I think it is to do in broader society. And by that, I mean, because I believe that my life is richer and better for the more worldviews that I'm exposed to, I make the effort that I described and bring colleagues who are of a different political ideology, for example, to Colorado. Last year, we brought a Republican representative who's a good friend of mine, who represents the state of North Dakota, to come enjoy, someone who's coming out here for a country music concert, actually at Red Rocks, which is in our district. And I told him, look, why don't we get together and we could show you some of the farms in Boulder County, the regenerative agriculture practices that we're having here are being implemented in Boulder County that I think you'd be really inclined to support. We serve on two committees together. And so in any event, have developed sort of burgeoning friendship. And I am making every effort that I can, similar to the effort I make with, friends of mine from, my prior career as a lawyer or from college and law school and so forth. And so I would certainly encourage every person to do that. But part of the challenge is I'm not sure that the curtain has been lifted on the massive manipulation that is perpetrated by the technology that we've talked about. And so the only real way, I think if most folks did what Brad described, if they watched CNN for 10 minutes and then Fox for 10 minutes and then CNN for 10 minutes and then Fox for 10 minutes and did that for an hour, they would come out of that experience with a far more substantive awareness of just how much these echo chambers driven, by fear, are motivating us to disregard and disrespect any view that is different than our own. And I think with that awareness, right, with that knowledge, like so much else in life, one will then decide to perhaps change their own behavior and model that in their own lives. And that to me is how you do it across the broader society. But I will, confess that this is a part of this is a challenge that I'm not sure I've necessarily, I think we're all trying to rise to the occasion. And the questioner is right to pose the question, because it's one thing for me to do it in my own private life. It's another thing, quite another, for me to try to find more ways to motivate constituents to do the same. And of course, I am on Twitter, as I'm sure every one of our panelists. I follow Brad. I'm going to follow Blake after today, and Professor Limick and Phil. And so, I see Phil doing this on many occasions, and you talked a little bit about this already, Phil, with your tweets and your statements about trying to find a way to listen to others and have a sense of empathy that perhaps is missing in our body politics. So, look, it's a great question. I'm not sure that we're necessarily doing as much as we should. And it's probably a clarion call for us to do more in that regard.
Blake, I want to go to you and give you a question from Courtney, and then I have a final question for everybody. She says, fantastic panel. What responsibility, if any, do you think science fiction writers should have about being cautious about the worlds that they write about that could then influence technology, policy, and culture? And she, of course, thinks about Brave New World. Blake, do you ever worry that if you choose to write about certain dark themes, it will encourage it at all? How much do you give thinking that what science fiction writers write about could have, call it, normative influences on the world? Of course, the flip side is you could also write about it in a way that's meant to be cautionary. But do you worry about messages or impacts that science fiction can have on the world?
Oh, it's a great question. I think about it, never more so than the book I'm working on right now. What I think about more is what I kind of said earlier, the idea that really the future's here. And we're at this really interesting moment where, as a species, we have our arms around a number of technologies that have the power to destroy us, literally just annihilate us, or accelerate us into the next iteration of whatever humanity or humanity plus is going to be. Splitting the atom, gene editing, the rise of superintelligence. What I consider my role, aside from, I mean, I don't want to be pretentious. First of all, when I'm sitting down to write a book, I'm like, what is a really cool, fun story that a lot of people are going to love? That's what I do. But in the background, and as the book evolves, I do start thinking about these deeper things. And I think the important thing to do is to try to put your finger on the idea that we are at this moment in a whole number of fields. By the way, what's really just washing over me during this fascinating panel is that information technology may be the thing that destroys us. It's not going to be we blow ourselves up or create the superintelligence that becomes our overlords. It's just going to be we destroy ourselves because we expose ourselves to ourselves at a exponential level that we cannot process, and in doing so divide ourselves irreparably. So we're at a moment, and this moment, when I say a moment, this moment may extend for another 10 years, it may extend 50 years, but we're in this moment and we just need to be aware of how pivotal it is.
Perfect for the last question, which is first to Patty, and then we'll go to Joe and Brad and let Blake get the last word. What is your biggest hope? What is your biggest fear for the near future? You can think of that as next 2 years, or if technology accelerates, the next 10 years. So,
Okay.
Patty, what would you say?
Yeah, well, I must have a little diagnostic moment here with my temperament, because I don't have any problem at all with coming up with the hope part. And for what a cheerful person I am. I'm doing really well in the hope part. So the hope part is that we can get over specialization. Now, that may not make a world of sense, but specialization, we've been doing that for over 100 years, and all kinds of expertise exists, and it is isolated and siloed and unavailable to anybody else there. So that has been a wonderful, we've learned so many things through specialization, but it has fragmented, and all kinds of opportunities to come together and find out what there's no serious issue that can be taken up by one point of view or one discipline or one issue. So I was having quite a fantasy here for a moment of a sort of speed dating thing where each of us would be matched with the other and then go to the other people and bring them in. So Blake and I, we are going to work. This is my little fantasy moment here. We're going to do, I taught a course years ago on historical fiction. So when you were saying like, oh, it's not science anymore, it's fiction, I thought, yes, and we must create different visions of what the past had that we could have as goals and aspirations. So you and I were working on a project there. You never knew that, Blake, but we were really going to town on that. And then we're going to go to the congressman. We're going to say to the congressman, your thoughts about how do you take this to a wider thing? We have this amazing project that we're working on, which actually is not too far away from something we are doing at the center. We do have a project called Bipartisanship and Friendship Happen. And we started with Mark Udall and Bob Beaupre, and then we got knocked off by the virus. But that was a wonderful event, but we're going to have, I'm not going to be able to do this because this is not my gift, but it's his. We're going to have amazingly powerful fiction about bipartisanship. And I can't get you there because that's not my world, but I have some ideas, and he'll take them and he'll turn them into things that people would actually want to read. And then we'll go to Brad, and then we'll say, Brad, that wonderful exercise that you had with, we're going 10 minutes on Fox and 10 minutes on, we need you to help us figure out how we take our ideas. So anyway, that we just keep building, and finally we can really get past this misery of specialization where we have our boundaries and our talents and they're confined. So, and then my fear, is that it's going in such a different direction from my day-to-day interactions. Because I can't recall when I last watched any television. I'll just say that. Public intellectual who has no idea what the public is doing or thinking. But I just fear that disparity between the fact that I spend time sometimes on screens now, but with good-hearted people who are wanting to, we're calling it the party of practicality, the people who would like to do things, who would like to take a problem, think about it, figure out approaches, that the party of practicality is not going to be there because of the fragmentation. And boy, I think the comments from this panel about the unseen manipulation that has so much power and has, this power is how do you get at that power when it is so not so, it's so manifested but not noticed? That is the weirdest kind of power to think of. So my fear is that manipulation will continue and keep the party of practicality, who are transcending specialization and enjoying each other's company, from being all they can be.
So Joe, Patty's hope is the party of practicality will transcend specialization. What's your hope and what's your fear?
Well, I have a lot of hopes and a lot of fears, and of course, with respect to the matters that we'll be taking up in Congress. But I guess I'll step back a bit and perhaps be a bit more esoteric in that. And my hope, central fear are somewhat similar. I mean, central fear, I suppose it dovetails with what the professor mentioned, is that we as a species will be unable to overcome the differences and divisions, the latter of which has been exacerbated by the developments in information technology that we've talked about, ad nauseum tonight, to really meet and overcome the profound global challenges that will face us, again, not necessarily as a state or as a country, but as a species. Climate change, which we haven't touched on this evening, but an existential threat, a planetary crisis that will touch each and every person on Earth. A global pandemic that, Brad touched on this, but, the likes of which we have not seen as we think about history, 100 years. That's my biggest fear. My hope is that won't be the case, that we will overcome those differences, those divisions, and we'll meet the moment. And I'm an eternal optimist by nature and by experience, having had the pleasure and the privilege really of being able to, serve now in the United States Congress as someone who, whose family background and the like would not suggest that I would end up serving in the United States House of Representatives, and yet here I am. I believe that ultimately I think Professor Limerick said this at the very top of the hour, humans are fundamentally resilient, right? If history is offers us anything, it tells us that we are resilient, creative, imaginative, and I believe that ultimately we will rise to the occasion, we'll meet the moment. So that's certainly my hope, and I have to hold on to that hope to overcome the fear.
Ed?
In the last couple of years, I've become very interested in Buddhism, not as a religion and not as a spiritual practice, but as a philosophy. So I've read a lot about it. So I'm going to answer your question with my version of a very probably poorly formed, but in the moment Zen koan. My my hope, and I'm going to answer it from a personal perspective versus for society. My hope is that I can continue to maintain non-attachment to my hopes and fears. And my fear is that I won't be able to maintain non-attachment to my hopes and fears. And the reason I say that, and I sort of offer that up as a thing, as a all good Zen koans to sort of ponder, is the number of things that we have control over is very, very limited. And any individual has control over is very limited. We're operating in endless collisions of complex adaptive systems that are not deterministic, not predictable, not controllable, not manageable. I said it earlier, much of our behavior is driven by fear, and you could also say driven by hope. But it doesn't matter then what happens, you then have more hopes and more fears. And so your behavior continues to be driven by your hopes and fears until the moment, and Patty described it early on, that everybody that has died has, which is that you live up to that moment and then suddenly you don't anymore. And I think as a community, at whatever level, you start very small or you expand very broad, as humans, we can't control other people's hopes and fears, but we can control our own motivations, or we can modify our own motivations based on our ability not to be driven by those in terms of what our actions are. And then when we accomplish it, need more of the good and less of the bad. But instead can just live in the moment and recognize that there's an awful lot of things outside our control. And so then we can deliberately choose where to spend our time and energy in what in our frame of reference is something that's, again, pick your adjective, not mine. Mine is that's of service to the communities I'm part of. But you get to pick your own. I'm not trying to map mine towards you. So that, I think that's the Zen koan, which is ponder that for yourself. And the fears that are driving behavior, are they really helping you to hold on to those fears and the reinforcement of them? Or the hopes that you're hoping for, is that really helping drive your behavior? And if the answer is yes, awesome. But if the answer is no, think about it some more.
Blake, you get the final word.
I mean, I think the fear is very much in the air of the panel that we're talking about. We're deep in the second act of the movie where we kind of see where this is going. We hope it doesn't go that way, and we're hoping for that third act turn where reason and good prevails. So I don't want to dwell too much on the fear. First, I'll give you the practical hope. The practical hope is that we globally learn to live more thoughtfully in the information age. We're doing a very bad job of it right now. We're being manipulated. We're letting ourselves be manipulated, to Brad's point. And I hope that we take that control back for ourselves. And on the hippie, let's all hold hands hope, I would like to stop seeing, and I'm very guilty of this, I would like to stop seeing people as the predetermined modifiers that I associate with them, the group that they associate with, the club that they're in, and see them be, because you strip all that away. That stuff like melts in a second when real terror, horror, stakes come into the picture. And we forget, the demonization is so alluring, and because it's easy. And I would like to stop doing that. I would like us all to stop doing that and see us for who we really are, because not everyone really even believes the things they're espousing. We're just continuing to spew what we have been told to spew by the manipulators. That's my hope.
In a concrete example, I was in a rural Coloradan community where someone who had been a teacher and was with former student who is an elected official and said, this person just wants to serve. If this community was a Democratic community, he'd be a Democrat. He said, yeah, pretty much. He was in the party of practicality, Patty. In a practical note, by early next week, you should get a link. That would be the recording. You can share it with others. Also, a survey. We'd love your thoughts and feedback. And for those attorneys among you, you get a link to get CLE credit for grappling with these set of challenging legal, policy, ethical communities. And if you want to share it, I think you just got in the chat a post discussion that you can sort of think about. We really want you all to keep thinking. That was the goal of this panel. I know I speak for all of us. We thank you for taking the time with us. Look forward to continuing the conversation. Appreciate everyone for joining us. Thank you all.